Greetings, everybody, and welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual component of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, Argentina comes to City Lights. We are delighted to have Julia Kornberg with us in the house, celebrating the publication of her debut novel. It is called Berlin Atomized. It's published by our friends over at Astra House. She is going to be joined in conversation by the fabulous Mauro Javier Cárdenas. But before we get started, I would like to remind everyone we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take a moment in recognition of the original stewards of the land around these parts. Berlin Atomized is a breathtaking apocalyptic novel that begins in Buenos Aires and very soon jumps around the world. There is a very kinetic, percussive quality to the writing, the pacing of the plot. It follows the trajectory of three siblings as they are swept away by world events. The emotional ride runs the gamut from tenderness to utter exhilaration. It's a book that immediately caught our eye here at City Lights. Julia Kornberg is originally from Buenos Aires, but currently lives in New York City. Her work has been published in the New York Review of Books, the Jewish Review of Books, The Drift, Book Forum, McSweeney's, amongst others. She's a candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, studying the role of translation and translation theory in modern and contemporary Latin America. Her IHUM fellowship, during that period, Julia is going to be self-translating her unpublished second novel, La Fiestas, under the guidance of the magnificent Alexander Heyman. So joining Julia in conversation tonight, we are delighted to have back in the house Mauro Javier Cárdenas. He is, of course, no stranger to City Lights. We've had the pleasure of hosting him many times before in the past. Mauro is originally from Ecuador. He is the author of American Abductions, published by Dalkey, also Aphasia, The Revolutionaries Try Again. In 2016, he received a Joseph Henry Jackson Award, and also he's received the Hay Festival in Bogota 39. This is a selection of young Latin American novelists, so he was included in that selection. So before we start, I want to remind everyone that we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard, of which you may purchase books. We'll also be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the talk, so please post your questions and comments in that same chat function. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Julia Kornberg and Mauro Javier Cárdenas. It is such a pleasure to have you both here with us, and welcome to City Lights.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Julia, qué gusto que estemos aquí juntos un ratito para conversar, ¿verdad?
Muchas gracias por todo.
Sí. All right. So I have a few questions for you. Let me start with, every time I start a new novel, I like to believe I can go back and look at the old ones and sort of figure out, like, okay, what were some of the original impulses that started the novel? What are some of the seeds of those novels? And in some cases, it's easy, right? Oh, there was a new news article that really sparked everything. In some cases, a little more difficult to trace. So my question to you is, I'm wondering, when you now look back at this first novel of yours, where does that begin? Where does that seed begin? Where does that impulse to write this book begin?
I think it began well, it's like my first novel, and I feel like a first novel, it's usually just like whatever impulses you've been collecting throughout your teenage years and your early adulthood all get kind of like vomited into the page. But beyond that, I think most specifically it was just traveling in the South American summer of 2016, 2017, I went on a really long road trip with some girlfriends of mine, and I just started to create this like stories that I thought were short stories about a single family throughout time. And then it turns out it was a novel, and some people helped me look at it that way, but it was basically that. It was in traveling, like in trains and hostels and like people's couches, that it began.
And were you traveling through South America?
No, I had done that the year before. I had done my like little Chihuahua trip, like through Bolivia and Peru, but I went to Israel and then I spent the rest of the summer in Europe, and that's sort of where it began.
Got it. And then as you I'm wondering, and we'll get to the book in 1 second. So I'm gonna just sort of think. I'm curious. We never really talked about this. So as you were, traveling and collecting the stories, what precedes that from a kind of literary perspective? Meaning, what were some of the influences, the books you were already reading? Like, what is kind of what was your canon at the time of books that were kind of, I know you mentioned there's a few books that are mentioned, but it's hard to tell if those are influences to your writing or not. Like there's a Chekhov's mentioned, there's like a Cheever's mentioned. So I'm curious about that.
That's a great question. I think I was 20 and I hadn't read so much at the time, but so I think my influence were very like canonical Argentine literature. I was interested, I loved Borges. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I loved Sarmiento. I think, have you read De Facundo by Domingo Faustino Sarmiento?
Cuando era niño, a very long
It's like
time
a
ago.
19th century book written by like the most controversial Argentine president, where he basically presents this binary between civilization and barbarism. And but it's a really interesting book because this binary gets displaced in all sorts of ways. One of them is the dichotomy between land and city, the country, the field, the pampas, and the city. And I think that was really on my mind when I began to be interested in Nordelta specifically, because Nordelta, for those who don't know, is this kind of like gated community that ultra rich people created in the middle of nowhere in Argentina. It's like an hour away from middle of nowhere. This is my porteño centrism talking. But it's like an hour away from Buenos Aires in like a wetland that was emptied out, and they created this kind of like mega city, like a gated community with hospitals and shopping malls and all sorts of everything that you need for basic life. And they sort of locked themselves there. And I was thinking a lot about Sarmiento and about how his binarism between city and countryside no longer kind of applied to places like that. I think I was interested in narrating cities. The introduction was very like Learn inspired. Jorge Luis Borges writes Clon Ucbar Orbis Tertius about this kind of like imagined plot between intellectuals across history, and dates it in a later date than what it was. I think he publishes it in 1939 and dates it 1942. And I thought that was such a cool, like sci-fi little gesture. And I wanted to do that with the introduction. And then I don't remember I remember I was reading a lot of Sylvia Plath because I was a young girl. I would say maybe those three were very present.
One of the, you started mentioning Delta, which I found fascinating because I'm from Ecuador. I'm from Guayaquil. I grew up over there. We have our share of gated communities, right? And I feel that I read over the years. I haven't traveled too much in South America, but I've read over the years that South America really has, in many cities, you do have this sort of gated communities, which are, at least in Guayaquil, the way that were set up, there were all this massive walls, so you couldn't get in. You had to get in, you had to pass a guard, and if you didn't look a certain way, or if your car was a certain way, like you got a lot of questions to get in, and like they had to like call an intercom and all that. And then the houses themselves had walls that you couldn't actually see inside. You couldn't see like what was inside, like. So like you had no idea that there was this mansion inside. You just knew that there was this humongous wall. Can you describe for us in Nordelta that shows up in the book and kind of what it looks like and how do you think is, you started mentioning some of the differences, like the peculiarities of Nordelta, right? Felt interesting to me.
It's a crazy place. I didn't grow up in one of them. I grew up very much in the city, and like I was exposed to like drug dealers and nudists at age 4. And I was always interested by Nordelta because I had friends who had like summer houses there, and some of them like even lived there. And it began being like a real project in like the late 90s, early 2000s, when Argentina had like its worst economic crisis. So the city became really sketchy. And when you go to Nordelta, it's sort of like that. It's like this huge, it's humongous. It's like the size of Brooklyn or something. It's this huge neighborhood. There used to be a swampland. They drained every body of water that was there. They expelled the fauna. Like there were a lot of capybaras that had to leave and other undesirables, and they created a huge wall. And then there are these like neighborhoods, and according to your like class, you have, you have different neighborhoods. The most prominent one is called La Isla, which is the island where houses are like a couple $1 million each. But it's different from what you describe in Guayaquil, because I think that they're trying to sort of emulate the feeling of an American suburb.
Ah,
So it feels really open and very idyllic, and children playing with their bikes, and everyone's like pretty and rich, which is fun in itself. And then there's this whole class aspect to it, which is additional, which is that there is help. There's a lot of help, but a lot of them are not allowed to walk in the neighborhood. So you don't actually see, the lower class workers. Like if you're a maid, you come in a van and the van drops you off at the house and you work in the house and that's it. So it feels really eerie, and you have everything. You have supermarkets, malls, like a lot of restaurants, golf courses, tennis courts. You can play soccer. Like you don't have to leave Nordelta or any place like that if you don't want to. Which I found really attractive because it feels kind of like a Truman Show existence. And when I went, it was always like, wow, like my friends, they're so, they're so happy here and they have all these lawns, but it feels really weird. Like there is like a really eerie sensation to it. And they all have bulls, which, in South America is like a prized possession. With the long hot summers. So that's kind of like the vibe of Nordelta in Argentina. And it's very much a project that was created to escape the city, to escape the reality of what like the 2001 economic crisis had created. And a lot of families moved. My father moved to one like shortly after I published a book in Spanish.
Really? Oh, interesting.
It was quite funny. I will never forgive him for that, but
Well, it's interesting because for those who haven't yet read the book yet, the siblings that are the core of the book come all from Nordelta, right? And so it's the starting place. And I didn't grow up in a gated community either, but I had friends from high school, and I would also go and depending on anyway, it was when you're young, like you take it for granted that this is a world that exists and its own, and like you don't yet have at least I didn't have the lens to be able to critique it or understand the eeriness of it, which I think the book gets to. One of the questions that I have for you related to that, I've been thinking a lot for the last few years about what makes 21st century literature distinct from other literatures, 20th century, 19th century, and so on. And it's a fool's errand, right? Because you can make all kinds of footnotes about whatever statements you make.
enough hopeless theoretical questions.
Yeah, but one of the aspects that I really enjoy about the book is it does one of the things that I consider very 21st century, which is the characters are sort of excessively knowledgeable of narrative, as I think a lot of us are, meaning we've watched enough movies, TV shows, TikToks, read enough books. Like even my own kids, I will tell you, they always guess what's going to happen next in a movie or a show. So they have this sort of narrative knowledge, which often sort of when we're talking about experiences in the past, we're making references. There's even like a passage in the book where you're like, describing, oh yeah, he was like an scripted boyfriend, you know. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of how that came to be and how the characters use a sort of excessive narrative to exist in the world.
Yeah, I don't know if that was intentional, but what I do think was intentional was that I think for me, what distinguishes 21st century literature is how our brains have been completely like fucked up by the internet. And how our way of thinking has changed. I've been thinking about this a lot too, because I've been trying to think about what kind of literature makes it feel contemporary. It feels like we are, you know, at the beginning of the century, we have this thing called the internet. It's like this huge invention, and we're at the same place that people from the avant-garde were when the radio and like telecommunications were invented, right? But when you're writing in like 2025 or whatever, is it enough to say that a character is like on Tumblr or like on WhatsApp, or that they're like texting all the time, or they don't have an attention span? I don't think so. But what I do, or what I've been trying to do, and I don't know if this book does it to the extent that I would like it to, but I do think that there's an attempt to try to see how our way of thinking, like our like deeper unconscious, has been like overdetermined by it, and like the constant influence of information. Like the siblings, they have all these references, but because it feels natural to have a million references today. It's not because they're like particularly smart, they're just like online all the time. And so am I, and so are we. So it's like it's quite, it felt quite natural to them to have this kind of like overdetermined narrative. And I wonder if part of like what makes them be so erratic is that they've lost, because of it, maybe they lost like a certain ability to be surprised. I feel like that, at least. Like I feel like I'm quite jaded, and it takes a lot for a movie or a book to shake me. And I wonder if they're doing that with their own lives just because they want to just like really flee the kind of hand that they've been dealt, which is a really nice hand. Like they're like rich kids from Buenos Aires. It doesn't get better than that. and and I think they don't like that. I think they're uncomfortable with it. And I think, yeah, the path that they set out to form for themselves is escaping that hyper narrativized sense of destiny. Because, you know, if you're a rich kid from Buenos Aires, you don't have to be anything else. Like you can stay and be fine and live in one of your parents' additional apartments, and you'll be set. But I think maybe they're not comfortable with that, or it doesn't satisfy them.
That's a very sort of interesting way of thinking about it, right? Because, and it hadn't really occurred to me before, that if we are so knowledgeable of narrative and we know what's going to happen next in narrative, that also means that we're very likely know what's going to happen next in our own lives, unless we make drastic changes, right? Like I think some of the characters sort of make some decisions, right, to shake up. Like we probably know, like more or less, based on where we are now, putting aside accidents and like global warming and like, you know, being rounded up for deportation, you know, there's a certain amount of like, you know, I think interesting how that works in your characters in those books, right? In this book.
There's a certain hubris to that too, though. Like maybe like an anti-Berlin Atomized would be like trying to figure out like how these three characters stay in Buenos Aires, stay in Nordelta, have the perfect pre-planned life, and then, as the Yiddish joke says, man tracht, Gott lacht, like man plans and God mocks him. But yeah, I think they're trying to escape that for sure. And they think they know everything because they were brought up in the internet, which makes you feel like, you know, because you've been on Wikipedia for 3 hours every night.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And what you were saying earlier about 21st century literature and internet, right? It's just the dramatization of how this reference mania and this sort of like how we generate things now quickly, much more quicker, right? Because of the internet, because we have sort of you can go from here to here to here very quickly. It's something that
Yeah,
I also.
I like, because like I noticed that American Abductions is kind of like a hyperlink novel too. Like it
Yeah.
has that. And I feel like I've integrated that to my writing. Like when I am writing, let's say I want to make a comparison, but I don't know quite enough about this very specific topic. I just go on Wikipedia and find the perfect analogy. And it might take me like 5 minutes, but it's like fine. But then you end up with something that's quite different to what like 20th century literature would have been, because it takes you like a few hours to make that comparison.
Right. Yeah. Or sometimes what I do is the characters will be talking and then they'll be like, oh, let's search this. And then they pretend that they're talking to them. It's like, oh, and then they do a search, while they're doing it. So I think those are some nuances of 21st century that are interesting. Another one, 21st century aspect of it, which I haven't really thought it through, but your book kind of make the connection to some things I've been thinking about. And I wonder this is a question for you and a question in general, right? Like, I wonder how much writers are thinking about this. Is the notion of, and maybe every generation feels like, oh my God, like these are terrible times, and something must be done, right? Every generation probably feels a certain amount of powerlessness related to their environment and the injustices that happen around it. And I think the difference perhaps is that technology allows potentially for other avenues of disruption for those who are interested in any kind of dissidence. So I was interested in, the future narratives. When you get to the future, when you get to the new resistant, I wonder, like, could you give us a little bit of context of how that came about, how that sort of ended up shaping as part of the novel? Because I tell you, even some of the things that you mentioned about, like, where a message gets sent out to everyone, like, that was literally like last week I wrote that into my novel in progress, where I was like, that idea that, like, can technology, can you disrupt the process of deportation by, disrupting the targeting in the computers, by disrupting, like, you know what I mean? Like, so I was thinking about that the technologists as dissidents, is very
Yeah.
unique to the 21st century. So can you tell us a little bit more about that in the context of the novel?
Or even like turning off the surveillance, right? Like I'm technically zooming to you from Tirana because I have a VPN and I change up the country that I zoom from like every
Oh.
not where yeah. It's very funny until like your entire Google gets changed into like Azeri and you're like, I don't understand what I'm like looking at. But yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. I think that I agree with you. It feels like the times are very like part of them are partially like cruel and sinister, but also boring in terms of political narratives. And it feels like we're kind of lacking as a youth, like something that would shake that up. Like as a young person, I don't really feel like there's any kind of movement that represents me or that I would feel like comfortable partaking in. Even though I had like a really Trotskyist youth, I feel like even that is no longer it's no longer so interesting to me the way that it's like laid out today in Argentina and maybe in the US too. And I think that the internet is very interesting because on the one hand it does give you these like avenues for disruption, and at the time I was reading a lot of like hacker narratives from the 90s, and like people like Edward Snowden were kind of, or Aaron Schwartz were very interesting to me. There's kind of like people who were like aiming to do something with information and data and kind of have these. But what was the most interesting to me about that was that there were kind of like Pacific revolutions. When you hear about guerrilla insurgencies, you will almost always hear in Latin America about like the bloody counterparts that happen. In Argentina, I don't know how it was in Ecuador. Didn't you have Sendero Luminoso? What
Peru,
does
I was
that?
in Peru. We had Alfaro Vive Carajo.
Oh, there
ours.
you go.
Yeah.
But those were bloody, and people like Snowden and Schwartz were just kind of like not. They were trying to like raise what you could call revolutionary consciousness through the internet. And that was very interesting to me. Like, what are the potentials that the internet has that could lead to non-violent ways of insurgency? And I think that's how I viewed the new resistance. Of course, because when you're writing, you can't help but things like try to make things interesting and a little bit more nuanced. Of course, the new resistance turns bloody. But that was kind of like the conception of it. And then the other thing is that the internet itself is very interesting because we use it today for everything, but it's actually like this military weapon that was invented by a bunch of like scientists in the Pentagon to like win the Cold War, and now it's used to surveil us and control us. And what in the 90s maybe felt like this kind of like new interesting insurgent technology is now this very limited thing where we're spending most of our time on like Twitter, Wikipedia, and Gmail in my case, and whatever website, or maybe Reddit. That's kind of like that's an interesting, more insurgent, non-algorithmic website, I would say. But yeah, so how do you turn this like military weapon against the people who created it? And it's still a question that I think about in fiction a lot.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me that even though you and I haven't really talked that much, that it's in our mind, right? And that when I talk to folks that are trying to figure it out, that work in tech, that are trying to figure out the anarchist tech angle to things, and we start talking about like, if we were to write fiction that tells you like how you are going to get targeted if you do certain things, can that help you? So there was a sort of connection between like fiction and direct action that I thought was interesting, right? Where by fictionalizing ways of targeting, you can actually help people avoid it, so like the coders have a lot of interesting material to share. Anyway, so let me. I thought maybe if you wouldn't mind, since we're talking about the new resistance, if you can read a paragraph from the book to get folks a flavor of it. Page 182.
Sure.
There
My
is.
accent really comes out when I read in English. Just the
So 182, the paragraph starts with Angie then spent the rest of the night. That paragraph up to Jerry wins on the 183.
One sec. 182.
At the bottom it says Angie then spent the rest of the night saying.
Oh, I think you have.
Oh, because I have the gallery. Yeah.
I don't have any more galleys. What chapter is that?
It is the chapter.
Is it the Paris?
It is, yeah. It's this one. I don't know how to read that one.
Oh,
yeah. So
someone complained about the kanji and the katakana, the hiragana in this chapter.
So it's in the 180s. After once Charlie had gone to bed, is one big paragraph, and then a page that has, let's see.
Here. So Angie then spent to Jere Winst.
Yes.
Great. So I guess I'll read it now. Angie then spent the rest of the night saying outlandish things that didn't make much sense. She spoke about the new resistance, about its wide promise of a new Europe. Angie confessed that her party had been in communication with NR, still a mostly anonymous entity, although some of its actors had been found and jailed in CIA blind spots across the continent, and that she was working with them on their intelligence wing. Then she spoke about peace, about the possibility of waging a different kind of war in which civilians were spared while their complacency was alchemized into a revolutionary spirit. She mentioned cybernetics, espionage. Her faction may have been an arm, but they still had means to wage a war. War, Jere kept repeating, looking uncomfortable. And she spoke about a hidden community of hackers who work at infiltrating government intelligence agencies, tuning that data capital into direct political involvement. Data, she pronounced in Spanish. She spent so much time in communicating in other languages that she now mocked herself in an exaggerated Latino accent. I didn't understand what she meant by political, so I asked again. Guerrilla warfare, she said, and Jere winced.
Thank you. So that should give folks an idea of the kind of resistance that we're talking about. I laughed when you say the data, because one of the things we do in our family is that we actually we often talk in mock Spanish, like we're gringos speaking bad Spanish, like ábreme la puerta, por favor.
And I'm speaking like hyper in like Sofia Vergara Spanish.
It's really funny.
I also like to, yeah.
Another question for you. So one of the things that I also do when I finish a novel and I start a new one is I look back and say, okay, what do I want to do more of that I already did? What do I not want to do anymore? And where are the areas? Because that helps me figure out like what to do next. Like, because otherwise it's boring. And then there might be certain aspects thematically that I hadn't explored as much as I wanted to. And so I pick some of those up. I'm wondering, I'm sure you're working on a new book. I've already worked on a new book. Publication being what it is, sometimes it's a long time between the publication of the book. And like, for me, it's always like, I'm already like working on a completely different book. I almost forgot what you wrote. I'm wondering, what aspects of this novel, which it crosses so many different cities, thematically goes into the future, so it has a sci-fi element. Like there's a lot of really rich material. I'm wondering which of the materials or how has this novel influenced what you're working on now?
Yeah, so I just finished working on my second novel. And if you like the New Resistance plot and the kind of like Paris, Belgium chapter, like that's kind of like expanded and brought to like its absurd point. This next one, it's basically, and it takes place in New York, and it's a novel that happens in a kind of like probably like deep state department CIA program of languages, which with the internet are like two very important forms of capital that the intelligence services love to exploit, and within that very dark kind of like CIA university, this group of Latin American hacker insurgents appears, and they try to take over New York City and make it Spanish speaking. So it kind of has like an intense hacker cybernetics plot accompanied by like a lot of espionage and intelligence stuff. So I think, yeah, it's like those discrete chapters in Berlin are taken to the extreme in the next thing that I wrote.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm going to generalize, it's probably not true, but one of the things that we as South Americans, Latin Americans living in the United States, I often think, again, this could be probably not true, but I'm seeing in your work, and I'm seeing in what I'm working on now as well, that something about our experiences somehow coalesces into this idea of like, having grown up in South America, where our history is so wedded to CIA involvement, espionage, interventions, and now that we're here at the center of destruction, like how, you seem to be writing about, some of those themes, right? I'm currently writing about those themes as well. Like the role of the South American in, I don't like talking about the responsibility of South American writer, because that's not really possible to talk about, but it's interesting that, we're writing about similar themes, you know.
No, definitely. And can I ask you something? As someone who's like in San Francisco, do you feel like you run into like spies and spooks all the time? Because that's been my experience in like New York City and like Princeton University. Like I feel like there's
Really?
a lot of spies around me and people who are doing like intelligence stuff and that pretend not to. Yeah, maybe I'm just paranoid. Maybe it is like I'm like think about it too hard in the head. But yeah, I feel like spooks surround us.
I think for me, right, so I started working on the book I'm working on right now, which is about the U.S. intervention in Chile, but
Mm-hmm.
I put restrictions on the book, so it can't really be, you know, about the inner life of CIA agents. It can't be set in Chile, and so there are all the restrictions. So it's set in the U.S. about Chile intervention,
Yeah.
and so they're what I've encountered, started encountering more and more in San Francisco, is people that work in tech that over a long period of time reveal that they are actually working in direct actions, and they're doing interesting work to figure out how to use their tech for
Yeah.
disruption, right? And there's a certain amount of secrecy, and there's a little bit of and so I found that interesting because that was not, I did not encounter that at all like in the last 10 years. It's only recently that I'm starting to encounter folks in tech that, you know, for a long time, like the San Francisco story has been really boring. So there has been nothing around me that really triggers me. It's been mostly like the lie that tech is this great thing, but it's really just a vehicle for accumulation of profit. And then,
Yeah.
like on the last few years, I've been encountering tech folks that are completely disillusioned of the exploitation, and now I'm encountering tech folks that are interested in disruption, not
Yeah.
in the profit way, but in the kind of espionage way, in the counterinsurgency way. So anyway, yeah, that's been my experience here.
Like if everything's on the internet. Can't you just like hack it?
Right.
Like someone had like hacked the center of controls that like rules over our lives. I don't know. It's like not a feasible question for me because I can't put, you know, two and two together. I try to code. But it is an interesting question for fiction. Have you watched a movie called Das Netz?
What is it called?
Das Netz?
No.
It's like a really weird German documentary about like the CIA and the internet and how those two kind of like and the Unabomber and how those like three components are sort of combined. It's one of my favorite movies. I recommend it.
I'm gonna ask you more details about it afterwards. Because I'm very interested in the topic and doing research on it. And I tell you, I've talked to some tech folks that are thinking about like how to use drones to destroy surveillance cameras in order to do certain things.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And if there are any CIA agents on the line, please, this is all fiction, right?
I'm up for hire actually. Like I'm gonna PhD over soon. So well, that's the other thing that was interesting to me when I was writing, I'm sorry, this second book, and that it's probably interesting to you as well. It's like how the CIA has like infiltrated and paid countless of cultural projects and magazines and artists. And whether that was, you know, successful project or not. And when are they going to fund new emergent Latin American writers? Yeah.
Well, another fascinating point of similarities, I have a whole shelf of research related to CIA infiltration of the culture because, you know, my experience has been that folks that have grown up in the United States are very resistant to the idea their precious literature is in any way affected by propaganda or
Yeah.
espionage or any of that stuff. And so that
Yeah.
to me is a very interesting angle as well, is when you come from the outside to say, well, I didn't grow up with I grew up with part of your propaganda, right? Because it did sort of make it all the way to South America. But I didn't grow up with like, you know, basically alternative history books, right? They only tell one story. So anyway,
Some of my favorite poets are like CIA paid. I don't know. Elizabeth Bishop got like allegedly some nice money from the CIA. Lowell, like those are good ones.
it's crazy. So I'm gonna open it up for questions from the audience. Peter, do we have any questions that folks want to ask? I have a few more, but I want to
Still
make sure that
waiting. Yeah, you might want to throw a few starters in there until yeah, people kind of get it. Actually, wait. There are more comments than questions.
I love some of these comments, by the way.
Yeah.
Especially when they were like not pen. Oh, that was you, Peter?
Yeah.
And someone said books all around us. Thank you.
Well,
Mhm.
City Lights has an incredible section on like muckraking at the on the bottom floor that has an incredible selection of books about everything. And I remember, I'll tell you a quick story, Peter. I think you told us when Cartarescu was in town about how, I love this story. I think it made it into one of my books. That Ferlinghetti, when he got his FBI file, he could tell when the FBI agent was different because of the prose style. I love that.
Oh, it was so outlandish. I mean, some of them were so exaggerated, and you could kind of tell that somebody was trying to impress, right? And so it just made Lawrence laugh because he realized he couldn't possibly have been where they were saying. I mean, he knew he wasn't there, but I guess they had to kind of fluff it all up for the bureaucracy.
Oh, that's crazy. So if there's no question, I have a few more. So Julia, I'm very curious, and you don't have to reveal if you're actually a CIA agent, but I'm curious about the work you're doing in Princeton right now that is nonfiction related. Like you're doing a PhD. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I finished my dissertation last fall. It's about translation during the Cold War in Latin America and about 4 writers that sort of, as opposed to the Latin American boom, which was like this one very clear, cohesive movement, but also like a literary market apparatus with their like agents and translators and other literary helpers, kind of like found their own way in kind of like isolated corners of the literary world, and ended up either translating themselves or collaborating with their translators. So my first chapter is on Copy, who was a Uruguayan born, I think, Argentine writer who moved to Paris when he was 17 and wrote like these amazing novels and plays that are, to me, like very sci-fi, but are also kind of like Cesar Aira's main inspiration for his kind of like eccentric style. And I went to his archives and found out that Copy translated as part of his process of writing. So he would write in the very beginning like a few drafts, and one would be in Spanish, and then he would self-translate it into French. And I think the French would tell him something about the Spanish that wasn't working, and he would make some adjustments, and then he would translate it back into Spanish, and he would do that a few times. So I thought that was very interesting. I have a chapter on Puig, who co-translated with Suzanne Gilles Levine, his translator / lover, when he was living in New York. And I have a chapter about Lee Spector's like only Yiddish translation from Bella Chagall's post-Holocaust or pre-Holocaust, I don't know, like Holocaust-y book about her childhood in Belarus. And I have a chapter about Reinaldo Arenas and the lost tapes where he recorded himself for his memoir called Before Night Falls, which are also for me a kind of translation that he does. He was really sick of AIDS and would like talk into the tapes, and then a friend of his neighbor, who was a really interesting guy in itself, would transcribe them, and then he would give him pointers. So there was a kind of like co-translation happening with Reinaldo Arenas as well. But that's my work. It's like I was very fortunate. I like chose 4 writers that I really loved or love, and got to work with them, and it was fun.
Did you get to hear the tapes from Ronaldo Arenas?
I went to Miami and I heard them. They're amazing. They're really moving. They'll like bring you tears into your eyes because he was like very sick at the time, and he remembers his childhood and his youth and you will see like the brief moments where he kind of like gets kind of like an impulse of life and feels fine. And you can also hear him kind of like think out loud. You know, when you're telling a story and you have to command people's attention and you start to exaggerate and you start saying things that maybe didn't happen, and you're like, oh, it just makes it a little bit more colorful, so a few flowers on it. He does that all the time, which I think it's like part of why the book feels like a memoir, but it's so fanciful. And then he'll have like a horrible throwing, like coughing fit, and he won't be able to speak. So it's very interesting, and it's like they're like very moving but also very human. And by the end he's like delirious, like he talks about dreams, and you can't really like he recorded the last tape on the 4th of July. I think he died in November. And he's, you know, in his deathbed, and it's very interesting and very moving. Someone is asking me to type the names.
So the first one's Kopi. I'll tell you my story about Kopi, which I first heard about Kopi from Juan Pablo Villalobos.
Oh yeah.
In Barcelona.
Oh, he's a copy reader.
Yeah. So I have a collection of his works that has a picture of him, I think, wearing a maid outfit with like a knife. You know?
Yeah, he's a dragon. He's naked. That's cool.
Yeah. But you know, that was maybe 10 years ago when Juan Pablo, we went to a bookstore and he picked some books for me, and he picked that one. And you know how it happens sometimes that, I don't know if this happens to you, I'm sure it does, is that you place a book in a certain shelf and then you forget it's there, and years go by and you're like, and you don't know why you didn't pick it up. That's for me. I have it here somewhere. I'm gonna read it now that you brought it up.
It's your time.
This is my time.
I'm like trying to make it happen. Your translator who's working on one of his best novels, I think, called City of Rats, which is coming out with new directions. So
that's great. Exciting.
Yeah.
All right. So do we have?
We got some questions. We got some questions. Stefan asks, what are your thoughts on pursuing higher education in writing? Do you think your creative work would have benefited from or been harmed by the US MFA system?
Ooh, the eternal MFA versus New York question. I don't know. In Argentina, we have sort of, it's not an MFA system, but there are like a lot of like literary, like informal literary workshops that are set around writers. And I find that what happens is that the people who go to those workshops and then end up writing in the same style and with the same preoccupations as their teacher. And I don't know. I would have loved to do an MFA. I would have loved to be wealthy enough to afford like 2 years of just writing instead of having to do a PhD and do 7 years of academic work. I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't change the trajectory that I had because I think it was good for me. And I think sometimes cutting it on your own can be its own motivation. But yeah, I'm trying to think, what are some MFA, like people who came out of MFA programs that I'm interested in? And I can't recall any, but if I'm sure that it's a great place. And I know that the people who went there actually had like a warm experience of it. I'm not anti-MFA. I'm not into that in that world. And maybe I like Catherine Lacey. I think she did an MFA. Yeah, what do you think, Mauro? Would you have done an MFA if you could?
Probably. Like, I think in retrospect, it's easy to say like, oh, you know, screw MFAs. I did my own thing. You know, I could pick the books that I want to read whenever I want to read, and so on. But you know, when I was, you know, in my early 20s, like I who knows, like if I would have applied, maybe it would have helped. But I think now I really think about it in terms of consciousness, right? Like, is your mind ready to be in a place where you're being judged by individuals that have not read as much as you, do not like the same books that you do, and you're being sort of top down, being taught by somebody who might not like any of the books that you like, right?
Yeah.
I think that there is a time in your life when your mind is capable of existing in that environment without it affecting you. But I think that on the younger side, at least when I was younger, I was just like everybody else at a certain age. I was a fragile, writer in progress, meaning like I was seeking, like we all did back then, right? Some kind of affirmation that I was a
Yeah, you
writer,
really
somebody to come down and be like, yes, you're a writer, continue, And so I think that part, I think it's tricky, when you're on your apprentice years, to make sure that you're not being I don't think it's such a thing as, oh, if you went to an MFA, like the rest of your writing career could be impacted forever. No, it might just be a little bump in the road if you're not ready for it, and it might just take you a few years to get out of whatever environment you were in mentally. Anyway,
No, that's a great answer. That's a much better answer than you're right. Like when you're young, you really want to please and you want to but at the same time, you want to figure out what your style is, you want to like find your own voice. And if you have I have a friend who's applying for MFAs now, but he's 30 and he really knows what he's doing. So I think the MFA for him is just like 2 years of doing what he likes to do. And that's I see why he would do that now. Maybe when you're very young, if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, it can be like a risk to homogenize your style.
Definitely.
So Nancy has a question about speculative fiction, and do you feel it generates critical thinking? What are your thoughts about that?
I hope so. I think all fiction should generate critical thinking, and hopefully what I try to do, I have a lot of theoretical and sometimes even philosophical questions in my head when I try to when I'm starting to write a project, anything. Hopefully what literature does is like display those questions without giving you an answer. I like it when literature is kind of like open-ended and doesn't like tell you what you should think, but rather just like lays it out and says, well, you can look at it this way, you can look at it that way. And I think that's the kind of, at least that's the kind of fiction I'm interested in. The one that problematizes without giving you an answer.
Stefan asks, you mentioned some of the themes that might define 21st century literature. I wondered if you had any thoughts on formal qualities that might define 21st century lit. Your rotating first-person narrative in Berlin Atomized reminded me of Nausgard, Melchior, and the Savage Detectives.
Yeah, definitely Bolaño was someone that I was thinking about when I wrote Berlin, and someone who I felt gave me permission to set something in Israel. I felt like up until then I hadn't really read a lot of like literary Latin American fiction that took place in Israel, and he was like, oh yeah, you can do this. Or Lisa Lima in Israel, that was fun. That's a very interesting question. I think the question of form is also sadly tied to the internet in terms of 21st century literature, because we don't have the same attention span that we used to. So I try when I work with prose to obviously make it as beautiful as possible, but also to have it grab the reader in a way that that feels like it's worth your time. I used to think, like, when I was a teenager, I used to go to bookstores and be like, whatever I write has to compete with like Tolstoy. Are you kidding me? And now I'm like, whatever I write has to compete with like YouTube. And that's worse. So I think that for me, that's one of the questions. And also what we were talking about with Mauro, in terms of how that availability of information changes the way we produce and understand fiction. That's something that also changed with translation, I think. I once heard someone who translates from Japanese who's been doing it for 40 years be like, something changed when like sushi became global and people knew what tofu was for me, because I no longer had to describe this like soy cheese that people in Japan consumed, but people could just either understand it or Google it. And I think that with the internet, that also happens in fiction. Like now I'm like, I'm not gonna explain this. If you're interested enough, you can Google it. And I think that's a formal change as well.
Well,
I think that change that you mentioned is exactly what I think about when I think about the formal. I often think about, if you were to take a 19th century novel and start crossing out stuff that you no longer need to include because the audience has access to all that information, right? You can get somewhere. And it's not discounting the value of Tolstoy. It's not saying Tolstoy will be better if you do that. No. The point is simply to like look at old texts and say, what are the things that are no longer needed for your audience, right?
War and Peace would be like 500 pages long.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and I know a lot of people argue, well, like you include the lengthy description of a door because it somehow reflects the inner life of the character. No. That has been done a million times. So like that's the other aspect. Like if you know the history of sort of literature, there's a lot of stuff that's already been done. And so just grounding yourself on like what's already been done and saying, I won't do that, also creates sort of the new formal sort of approaches to fiction, I think,
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's liberating in a way to be able to just say Google it.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour, and this has been so much fun. And I really would love to thank you for gracing our virtual halls. Julia, congratulations on simply magnificent debut. And Mauro, always a pleasure and much gratitude.
Likewise.
Really. And to all of you who've shown up, thank you so much. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, keeping me dutifully employed and fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Adios. Take care, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Good night. Ciao.
Ciao.